And the first module is on smart global networks and how we can accelerate innovation, especially in healthcare. To moderate this session, I am very pleased to welcome two colleagues from the Stockholm School of Economics. Kathrin Reinsberger, who is an assistant professor at the House of Innovation, and Essén, also an assistant professor at the House of Innovation. Welcome.
Thank you, Katharina. And welcome also from our side to this session on global knowledge networks in healthcare.
Yes, so this session departs from the fact that digital technologies today provide vast new opportunities to generate data. You know, we can basically generate digital descriptions of all kinds of dimensions of our human bodies. And there are technologies for storing and accumulating such data. However, you know, simply storing and accumulating data doesn't make a difference per se. In order for data to become useful, it needs to be related to other data. Data needs to be put into context. It needs to be embedded in relationships between humans, between individuals and organizations. And that fact makes it a little bit more difficult. So in this session, we have a great diverse panel that will provide you with insights about how they are building these relationships in order to make a difference, in order to create improved living conditions for individuals and societies. And I hope that this session will make you question your own assumptions about what makes data useful and what we can do today, rather than just talking about the grand visions of the future regarding data in healthcare and regarding smart knowledge networks in healthcare. So welcome.
Well, to start off this session, I'm happy to welcome three keynote speakers. They all share the same interest in our topics of innovation, digitalization, healthcare, and data, but with diverse backgrounds, either from academia, as Ariel Stern, professor at Harvard Business School, or our industry experts, as Paul Gardien from Philips and Suzanne Britton from AstraZeneca. So now it's time to hand over to Ariel. Happy to have you, and looking forward to your talk.
Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be joining you today and to be kicking off this session. I'd like to start with a very big picture introduction around policy and managerial questions raised by the growth of digital health. And I will touch on a couple of the topics that my co-presenters and co-panelists are experts in, and then I hope we can all have a robust discussion as the morning continues. So I thought it would be extraordinarily useful to simply start off with the definition of digital health. What do we mean? So very, very broadly, when we talk about digital health, we talk about companies and products at the intersection of health or healthcare and digital technology. This includes, of course, the integration of IT and software into the healthcare system. And these activities, of course, present overlapping areas of opportunity. Something that I do think is quite important that I suspect we don't do often enough is think about the distinction between digital health versus digital medicine. These terms I find are often used interchangeably, and in many cases they do indeed mean the same thing, but it's an increasingly relevant distinction as we move digital technologies into the realm of the formal healthcare delivery system. So when we think about digital health, we think about this definition that you see at the top of this slide. We think about all of the products and all of the technologies that are involved in the generation of better health for individuals quite broadly. When I talk about digital medicine, I mean a subset of digital health. So digital health is broad, and digital medicine is the subset of those activities that meet two criteria. The first is that they are evidence-based. That might mean evidence from clinical trials or from real-world evidence, but digital medicine, like all medicine, is based on not just attempts to improve health, but actual evidence that the activities we're undertaking are meaningful and creating benefit. So evidence is the first piece. The second is integration with the formal healthcare delivery system. And the other speakers this morning are all coming from a perspective where the technologies they was sharing with us are technologies that integrate into formal healthcare delivery. So what that means is that an app for fitness training or for yoga that I use on my iPhone, that app, even if it's evidence-based, wouldn't meet my criteria of a digital medicine app unless it is somehow integrated with my formal healthcare from the healthcare system. So unless my primary care physician has somehow recommended that app or is using the data from that app, it is just a digital health and not a digital medicine product. And so I think this is an important thing to keep in the back of our minds as we continue this discussion. We'll hear more about this later in the morning, but digital health, of course, encompasses artificial intelligence and its applications in both healthcare and wellness more broadly. And all of these technologies benefit from new and better data, which we'll talk about over the course of the day. So this is a huge opportunity. This is data from the United States because it was the most readily available. But what you see is just that billions and billions of dollars have been invested in digital health in recent years. Each of the recent 5 years is a different line on this graph. And I think the big takeaway is that despite the economic downturn that began about 6 months ago, digital health in the year 2020 is actually on track to be its highest at its highest level of venture capital funding ever. I think that speaks to the importance of getting digital technologies right, especially and in fact, indeed, in a situation like the present one, where we're facing a global pandemic, and also the demand from both patients and healthcare practitioners for digital health products that create value and make our lives easier. So what do I mean? I'd like to give a few examples to make this a bit more concrete. So connected sensors, I'm sure many folks watching have a Fitbit or an Apple Watch. And we tend to think of these as digital health and not digital medicine products. We tend to think of these as tools we use to track our steps as we go for walks or to train for a marathon. But in fact, what we've seen, this is from a paper that we published earlier this year, is the dramatic growth of the use of connected sensors in formal medical research. So this graph, which is a bit small, actually shows us the tremendous growth. The cumulative annual growth rate is just over 34% over the last nearly 2 decades in the use of connected sensors in registered clinical trials. So this is formal medical research that's showing up in clinical trial registries in the United States and Europe. And so what we're seeing is the crossover of some of these consumer tools into formal healthcare research and healthcare delivery, which is quite exciting. We also mean things like software-driven medical devices. So many of us know people with type 1 diabetes. These are tools like software-driven insulin pumps and blood glucose monitors. And of course, AI tools for administrative work in healthcare, but also for diagnosis and treatment. Those 3 being really the big applications of AI in the healthcare delivery system, which I've written about with some colleagues as well. So the digital health revolution is upon us. I think that I hope that you believe me at this point. And something that I like to do when I talk about it is think about the impact of digital transformation on the 4 major parties, the 4 big Ps in healthcare. Who are the big Ps? Well, we have patients, of course, deliberately listed first here because that at the end of the day is what this is all about. Providers broadly encompass hospitals and clinics, so institutions, as well as the people who work in them, doctors, nurses, physical therapists, and then people like home healthcare workers who might be working outside of the walls of a hospital. We also think about payers. These It could be insurance companies or governments who are actually in the business of paying for the healthcare services that we're using, as well as product companies. So these are traditional pharmaceutical companies, medical device companies, but also software companies. And when we think about the digital transformation of healthcare, it's often useful to think about what are the benefits for each of these four parties that are promised or offered by a particular type of product or service, and what might be the roadblocks. So why might a certain product be a challenge for payers to actually adopt, or why might a certain product be particularly attractive for healthcare providers? And thinking about this in terms of the incentives of each of these parties is often a good way to shed a light on what is happening in digital health. Therein lies tremendous opportunity, of course. The challenge is what I call institutional mismatch. And to overcome institutional mismatch, we must think about what's going on. Well, when I talk about institutional mismatch, what do I mean here? What I mean in a nutshell is that the technology that has the most potential to transform healthcare these days would be unrecognizable to the architects of the healthcare delivery and regulatory institutions that we now have. Our regulatory systems and our hospitals were designed with the best of intentions in the last century. And the rapidly transforming science and analytical foundations, as well as the intense pace of innovation we're seeing today, are unfortunately increasingly mismatched to the institutions we have. This underlies many of today's challenges as well as opportunities. But specifically, medical device regulation, as we see it on both sides of the Atlantic, it simply wasn't designed with software-driven medical devices in mind. Hospitals, the way they're set up, made a lot of sense about a century ago, but these days hospitals are not set up for the digital optimization of operations or for the effective delivery of new technologies like cellular and gene therapies, which we'll hear more about over the course of the morning. I just want to give a couple quick examples of what I mean here. One would be digital medical devices, which we talked about earlier. This graph is from some research I did with one of my doctoral students a couple of years ago. This is an intense area of growth. What we see is an order of magnitude growth in software-driven medical devices that about over the last 2 decades. But this requires regulatory attention and policy redesign in order to actually support innovation. It requires policy leadership from the public sector, and it requires business leaders to think through new challenges, things like cybersecurity that will be with us forever when we talk about digital health, as well as realizing big opportunities, the opportunities that come with scale and data and apps and new tools. The second example is clinical trial innovation. We'll hear more about precision medicine over the course of the morning. But it's exciting to think we could target therapies to individual patients in a data-driven way. And medical information and analytics look so different than they did just a few decades ago. But despite that, we have a set of research and development norms and regulatory approval processes that were created with 20th century therapies and technologies in mind. And so I think it's important to ask, are there better data-driven ways to develop precision medicines? I've written a bit about this, but might we redesign clinical trials to incorporate just as much rigor, but today's computational power and the value of Bayesian statistics to make trials more efficient and more scalable, in particular for rare diseases. Today's adoption and innovation is currently driven by where barriers are. So we see the most commercialization of these new technologies when barriers are low and where regulation facilitates the commercialization of new products. And adoption is successful when these tools can fit into, enhance, or improve existing payment models and workflows. So I'll conclude with what's needed. So what's needed is policy and business model innovation to go beyond our current systems. And this is the responsibility both of policymakers as well as business people and the innovation ecosystem. We need sensible regulatory and public policy, and this is a place where I'm extraordinarily optimistic. On both sides of the Atlantic, exciting things are happening. The US Food and Drug Administration has been working on how to ensure that safe and effective software can be approved through the regulatory system in a streamlined manner. Late last year, Germany passed the Digital Healthcare Act, which has really paved the way for the digital transformation of the German healthcare system, including the prescription of apps by doctors when those apps have an evidence base for improving healthcare or patient welfare, which is quite exciting. And the European Commission has a work stream on digital health. But from the business side, new business models and reimbursement incentives are needed. We need new types of contracts that focus on quality. We need to focus on products that have clear value for patients and or practitioners. I come back to those 4 Ps, thinking about who captures the value of new digital technologies, and how can we make that value salient and do business model innovation around it. And we need to think about technologies that also support administrative work and operations, as well as creating value in diagnosis and treatment. So I'll stop there. I believe I'm out of time, but I look forward to the ongoing discussion and to hearing from our panelists. I believe next up is Paul Gardien from Philips, so I'll hand over to Paul.
Start video, desktop, share. Yeah. Yeah. Hello, my name is Paul Gardien. I'm in Philips Design, responsible for the experience design strategy and innovation. I work closely together with the innovation partners in Philips. And this talk will be from a design perspective, an experience design perspective. And on purpose, I've taken this picture of Philips as introduction, because Philips is known as a light bulb and television company. But over the last 5 years, we really transformed into a health tech company. So the focus of Philips currently is really on health and well-being. And that follows a couple of trends. There are more trends, but I picked a few, and I think they will be recognizable. So global resource constraints, the current healthcare system is really under pressure, and with COVID, that's only emphasized. And that means that we need to move from cure to prevention. Aging population and chronic diseases also means that we need to move more towards home. And I think the increasing consumer engagement is an important one, pointing to prevention. And the last one I put on this slide is digitalization, and that's of course the theme of this conference that's driving a lot of these developments. And for us in Philips, it means, but also for the healthcare system, of course, it means that we need to move from volume to value. So we value-based care and reimbursements for outcomes and not for volume of treatments. From response to prevention, the system now responds to health issues. We really need to move to prevention of issues. A link to that, of course, is from episodic to continuous. Connected care and digital plays an important role there. And last but not least, limited to accessible, making care more accessible. And that's not only in developing countries, that's also in developed countries. And in Philips, we have quite a big program, access to care. And the strategy that we developed for that, and it's really core to what Philips is standing for at the moment, is what we call the Health Continuum. So we believe that you only can change health when you think about it in a systemic way. So from healthy living and prevention to diagnosis and treatment, and then back home, seen as one flow. And of course, the theme of the conference, data and digital, is the backbone that connects this whole continuum. And a lot of developments have been done, and also in Philips we've developed a digital platform, for instance. But we see in general in the industry that a lot of digital developments are not taking up, or not integrated as well as they should be. And from a design perspective, we've done quite some research on that lately. And we see mainly three big drivers. So one is not addressing the real point or the real issue. Another one is, a big one is trust in the system. And last, the previous speaker also talked about that, is workflow. And I want to emphasize a bit on this in the few remaining minutes of this talk. So workflow from a design perspective has been really what we've been driving over the last years. So what you see in this picture is the workflow of a Nicu, a neonatal intensive care unit. And what we are looking at is from being at home, going to the hospital, first admission, going to intensive care. So what we do is we follow the whole patient, that's the gray line, but also in this case the mother, the physician. So everybody who's involved in this care pathway, we follow, and we map issues and issue cards to improve that workflow. And that's now really the basis of the work that we are doing. And of course, we're not doing that alone. So it's important for us to go into the hospital and do this with the hospital staff, and also with the patients, of course, to understand what is actually going on there. And just one example, linking that to digital and data. Again, this is a product that we recently launched about cognitive tests. And cognitive tests currently are mainly done on paper, which is quite cumbersome. And also the persons who do this test are struggling anyway, so it's difficult to understand the text. So we didn't focus only on digitizing the paper text and putting it into the cloud. We put a lot of emphasis at the front of the whole workflow, understanding and giving information about the test, helping people with the test. So there is a lot of help in the test, but also at the end of the process, where the physician explains, the neurologist in this case explains the results of the test, and we've adapted the tools for that. So again, looking at the whole workflow. And the last issue I want to address is looking for the real activities to support. And what we've developed is what we call data-enabled design. So not design as only information, but also design in the design data in the design process. And in this case, we looked at obesity, and the last resort is stomach reduction. But a lot of these stomach reductions fail because you also need to change your lifestyle. And to investigate that, we gathered a lot of data in the context of a number of families that suffer from obesity. And you can think of trackers, known trackers like the Fitbits and connected scales, but we also had smart sockets and buttons that we could assign to a specific condition or issue. And people could do that themselves. So for instance, one family linked the event button to boredom, so we could measure what their boredom was during the days. And just to, in view of time to round off, I will give you one case, and I think it's a bit of an obvious case, but it makes it drives the issue home why this is so important to do. So we had also trackers on the frying pan of the family in this case. And they told the physician we only eat once a week French fries. And of course, it turned out that it was not once a week, but a lot more often. So the treating physician was shocked. But it was not that the family lied about that, or they even didn't know how often they used the frying pan. But the real issue when asking to it is that they couldn't agree in the family in what to eat. So the son wanted something different than the daughter, and in the end they settled on French fries 6 times per week. And what it taught us is that it doesn't help to keep on talking to these people that it's not healthy, because they know it's not healthy. What we are developing is a module to help the family negotiate what to eat. So I think it's a nice example how we use data and try to find data in the field to look at what is the real application we need to develop and the real activity that we need to support. So I hope with these 2 examples, I gave you a bit of an insight how from a workflow perspective, but also from a data from the field perspective, we are looking at data and bringing data closer to people. Thank you.
So thank you, Paul, and let's switch over to Suzanne.
Great, thank you very much. So hello everybody, my name's Suzanne Britton. I work in the R&D IT organization in AstraZeneca. So just to quickly say thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me to speak today. It's an exciting opportunity for me to speak at a conference like this one. So as I said, my name, very quickly, an introduction to myself. So my name's Suzanne Brewerton. I work in the R&D IT organization at AstraZeneca. And my background is in bioinformatics. So I have a PhD in structural bioinformatics. And really throughout my career, I've sort of moved from core bioinformatics research much more into the software engineering domain, where we're looking at systems for enabling that core bioinformatics research. So currently I'm leading a group who are working in gathering data from across our organization in AstraZeneca, really looking at how we bring different omics data together from across the organization and how we maximize AstraZeneca's investment in that data by managing the data storage and the data processing and really making the data available for analysis. So AstraZeneca is a global pharmaceutical company, and as such, it's collecting data at every stage of the drug discovery pipeline. So this slide shows some of the recent innovations in automation and availability of data that I think my colleagues have already talked about today. And those will really feed into our drug discovery pipeline. So there was a sort of growing realization and recognition within AstraZeneca a few years ago that we need to be able to use that volume of data to inform our processes and shorten the time needed to discover new medicines. So we need to be able to mine that data and make data interoperable across the different stages of the discovery pipeline. and then apply that data into advanced analytics techniques to derive new insights from it. So AstraZeneca is now really investing in removing the traditional historic data silos and making data more fair, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable across the drug discovery pipeline. So for me in R&D IT, my specific group is working at the very beginning of that drug discovery pipeline in the discovery, preclinical and clinical space. And the group focuses, as I said, on bringing together omics data, so genomics, transcriptomics, proteomics, metabolomics data from potential data silos across the organization, from our partners as well and from public data sources. And we're sort of building systems for storing, managing, processing and analyzing that data with the appropriate metadata and quality control on the data as well, so that we've got a growing reusable asset that can be used in different contexts to identify new medicines for our patients. I'm going to talk very briefly today about one specific area that we've been working in my group recently. In 2018, AstraZeneca announced this partnership with Cancer Research UK to build the AZCI UK Functional Genomics Centre, and really to make that a world-leading centre of expertise in genetic screens, cancer models, CRISPR approaches and computational approaches to CRISPR data in order to be able to identify new targets for drug discovery, resistance mechanisms, to create new cancer mechanisms. And we've been, in my group, we've been working with the AZCI UK Functional Genomics Centre to build the computational systems necessary to process, store and analyse this data. So why functional genomics? So the Functional Genomics Centre uses the CRISPR gene editing technique, as I said, to make very specific cuts in genomic DNA of cell lines. And in that way, we can knock out the function of specific targeted genes in the genome, which means that we can use that technique to identify the essential genes in the genome under specific treatments. So we can screen compounds against the cell lines to determine if there's specific sensitivity or resistance to a particular drug. And in that way, we'll be able to understand the mechanisms of drug resistance and how we might better target a disease using combination therapies. So like I said, my group has been building the computational systems and the infrastructure to support that work, so to facilitate the bioinformatics work that's needed to process and interpret the data, but also to create this growing data asset that can be used and reused. So this particular collaboration was a really nice opportunity for my group to start from scratch and do it right from the beginning. Often in the work that we do in AstraZeneca, we're dealing with legacy systems and legacy data sets. And so this was a nice opportunity to be involved right from the very start. It also involves some interesting challenges in terms of being able to collaborate between the two organisations, so CI UK and AstraZeneca. We needed to be able to enable those two groups to be able to collaborate on methodologies, but also at certain stages in the workflow, be able to keep the data private and competitive data visible only to those people who should be able to see it. So functional genomics allows us to identify new targets, identify resistance mechanisms to medicines, and identify new combination drug treatments, but it isn't enough just to generate the data. There's a lot of infrastructure in terms of people, processes, and technology that's needed in order to drive forward in terms of this benefit for the patients. The Functional Genomics Centre is situated at the Milner Institute on the Cambridge Biomedical Campus, which is really close to AstraZeneca's new research facility, but also close to a number of other facilities. But also close to a number of other facilities, such as the Cambridge University Hospital and the Medical Research Council's laboratory for molecular biology. And so it's really at the center of this sort of increasing cluster of scientific, clinical and technical expertise in cancer. And there's a lot of potential synergy between these different organizations. So, and the collaboration with the Centre for the collaboration with the Cancer Research UK also enables AstraZeneca to sort of make the most of the interactions across Cancer Research UK. So I thought I'd also just very quickly mention our recommendation system project, as we've been recently feeding CRISPR data into this recommendation engine, and we've had some successes in identifying new targets in particular disease areas. Here we're collaborating with Benevolent AI and again, we're thinking about how we can find the right partner and learn from the different expertise in this particular area. And we're also building recommendation systems internally as well. So these approaches kind of assimilate the data from across the drug development pipeline. And in the case of the CRISPR data, we're using this approach to combine the CRISPR data with other omics data with literature data, patient data, and chemistry to be able to extract the relationships between the entities and infer new pathways, mechanisms, and potentially new indications for our drugs. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, I think there's a realization within AstraZeneca that we need to change the way we think about data in the organization and our approach to partnering. And this slide really shows some of the things we've identified as important to be able to maximize the investment that AstraZeneca is making in generating data. So specifically in R&D in my case, but across the organization. It really comes down here to people, processes, and technology, but really with emphasis on cultural change within the organization and sponsorship of that cultural change at the very highest levels in the company. That should make our partnerships easier and our data more open by default at a pre-competitive level. So I'll stop there, and I think we're going to go to a panel session next.
Thank you very much, Suzanne, Ariel, and Paul. I think we gained really interesting insights and lots of food for thought. Which brings me to my question to the audience. What do you think are the key challenges we need to address in order to make global knowledge networks successful? We are interested in your thoughts, so please provide your answers and thoughts in the chat function. We will collect them and pick them up later in the wrap-up of this session.
Yes, and you're also free to continuously post questions to the keynote speakers and the panelists, to us. So feel free to continuously write in the chat, everyone. Any questions are welcome, or comments. We will bring them up continuously. But now it's time to invite the panelists. And let me start with Maja Fjæstad. You're the Secretary of Health and Social Affairs in Sweden. And your areas of responsibility include e-health, social care, disability policies, and elderly care, among other things. Warm welcome. We have Lars Klareskog as well. You're a professor in rheumatology at Karolinska Institutet. And you've led international research projects using data in Swedish registries and in biobanks, ultimately with the aim of developing precision medicine that are accessible to patients, as you say. So you will be able to provide the academics perspective, working hands-on with research. We also have Erik Vetter, assistant professor at Stockholm School of Economics, my colleague. And Erik, you are participating in several policy-making discussion groups, one could say. You participate, for instance, in the EU high-level expert group on business-to-government data sharing, the UN Foundation Technical Advisory Group, and the World Economic Forum project Data Collaboration for the Public Good. So you will provide us with insight into the international policy making circles, so to speak. We finally have Andreas Hager, and I could give you many labels, but you sometimes refer to yourself as a patient support system entrepreneur. You have experience of working as an attorney and a consultant to many healthcare providing organizations and policy-making bodies. And you also work with helping patients, including your own daughter, to accumulate and learn from data about their own health condition. So you can provide the patient and family perspective as well as the legal perspective on how such data can be shared across contexts, across arenas, as you sometimes call them. So warm welcome, and we've asked you to comment or provide questions to the keynote speakers. So why don't we start with Lars? How would you like to comment Paul's presentation? Do you have any questions or reflections on his presentation?
Sorry, I very much share his views on the way forward. But having dealt a lot with similar type of things and interacted with patients a lot, one of the things that troubles me as always whether and how you accomplish motivation from patients to actually use these type of devices, in particular when it comes to chronic disease. And the thing is that the patient often wants to feel healthy and doesn't want to be reminded every day about his or her disease. So the question is, how do you motivate and make it attractive for patients to use these types of devices and accumulate the information that is useful for this patient?
Thank you, Lars. It's indeed a real good question. And if we crack that, then we crack an important issue. Adherence is an issue for a long time. Medication adherence is already difficult. What we did in the obesity project, and that's we really looked at the family and the support structure and the support system around the patient. What you see a lot is in products are focusing on the individual and on the individual patient, but we really believe we need to target a bigger support system. So that's why we looked at what we call co-responsibility around obesity, and how do we get the family also in there, so create a bigger system. And also the data and the data flow between the physician and the patient is an interesting topic, and the reaction of the hospital system to the data. But the final answer is still out there.
Well, yes, and I mean, just to comment, what we have worked with a lot in the context where I'm working is try to encourage the healthy parts. So sort of seeing what is the way of staying healthy and also make it a bit fun. So actually we have been working with also the gaming industry a little bit to make it attractive. But I think I very much share the views that you expressed in your lecture.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So that's a very relevant question, how to make it meaningful to participate as a donor of data, if you will, or as a user of the data. And you've touched upon the importance of interfaces in that context, both Paul and Lars, in terms of using gaming ideas or in terms of using visualizations, as you showed us, Paul. There's much to say about that, and we will return to that question later on in this session. But I would like to give Erik an opportunity as well to ask Ariel a question or a comment on her presentation.
Yes, thank you. So I thought it was an excellent presentation, and my question is more sort of forward-looking. So just to set that up, it builds on it was a really good distinction between digital health and digital medicine. And the implicit assumption is that healthcare takes place in the traditional healthcare space within the boundaries, as you were mentioning, sort of patients and healthcare providers. Most of the patient data regulation, like HIPAA in the US and elsewhere, is set up focused on healthcare providers that traditionally are the collectors and controllers of medical information. But now increasingly, as you mentioned, we see in the digital health space, increasingly consumers, and I don't say patients, consumers and companies can now collect and also even analyze data that traditionally has been seen as medical data. So as you mentioned, like smartwatches can now collect blood pressure, heart rates. Smartphone apps can collect data on mental issues like depression and stress. There is examples of people taking photos of skin spots and then crowdsourcing analysis to identify skin cancer, to take a few examples. So there is this digital health trend, and since it's not as regulated as the digital medicine space, the technology, the rate of technology development or industry clock speed, to use that term, is much faster, sort of outside traditional healthcare than inside traditional healthcare. So the question then is, do you see that this rate of technology development will speed up in the medicine space, or will the digital health space disrupt, in the words of your late Harvard colleague Clayton Christensen, will it be disruptive to the traditional healthcare space? Over.
Yeah, thank you. That's a wonderful question. Are you able to hear me okay? I had to switch devices between.
Yes.
No, so I'm so glad you asked that question. It's really quite exciting. I think something that we're increasingly seeing, and I think the last 6 months or so have really taught us a lot, is a number of phenomena, but a big one is the movement of services that were traditionally provided within the four walls of a clinic or a hospital into the home. And I think the best example of this, which is one that I've written about recently, is the growth of remote patient monitoring programs. And I think something that's quite compelling about that is this notion that we've realized, unfortunately, due to the pandemic, that for a number of diseases, we actually don't need to bring patients into the hospital to monitor their conditions. What remote patient monitoring programs do is take the work of measuring various biometric outcomes, anything from blood pressure to other vital signs, and outsource that work from healthcare workers within a clinic to patients and to their digital devices. And I think that's really exciting. I think there's massive opportunity there. Some colleagues and I have written about this in the Harvard Business Review over the summer. But what that necessitates is for us to be quite sure about the technologies we're using. And this isn't a call to slow down these programs, but rather a call for better and verified and validated data tools. There's a wonderful company called Electra Labs that I've done some work with, and what they're doing is actually putting together a library of digital tools that have been verified and validated in clinical practice and in clinical research. And what that allows us to do is then have a fundamental level of trust in the quality of the digital data we're getting, and know which of these products can be used and can be used effectively when we're doing things like remote patient monitoring, or when we're entrusting patients, as we should, because we now have the ability to do so, to monitor their own health and take a greater role in their disease management and their treatment. We want to do that, and I believe technology can be a force to help us do that and to accelerate the pace with which we can make this transformation. But we have to use the good technologies. We can't use the technologies that haven't been verified and validated in the clinic or in the field. Otherwise, we won't be making decisions based on useful data, and then we can forget it. So I think it's a really exciting phenomenon. I'm optimistic about it, but I think we need more companies and more focus on validation, verification, and usability of these technologies in order for this to really take off. But I'm optimistic there.
Thank you very much. So I think it's a good question and a very relevant one. The question is who should approve and who should put the stamp on these technologies? Are we talking about the established institutions, or I mean, does an app have to be connected to existing institutions in order to be a digital medicine tool? Or, you know, what is required for a tool to be a digital medicine tool? Does it have to be connected to a hospital, you think? Ariel, if I can jump in.
I think not necessarily. I think, I think, again, I'll go back to this distinction between digital health and digital medicine. The first piece is that there's an evidence base for a tool. So it's based on really reliable and well-collected clinical evidence and evidence from the field. The second piece is some way in which these digital tools interact with the formal healthcare delivery system. This does not mean that every single app needs to be completely integrated into every patient's electronic health record. But it does mean that somehow the data from the app are used, for example, by a patient along with their healthcare practitioner. It could be something as simple as there are actually some really exciting apps out there for physical therapy. So anyone who's ever had a sports injury, I count myself, unfortunately, among that population, knows how important physical therapy is, but also how difficult it is to actually remember the proper way to do exercises. So that, you know, the simple value of having a digital app that helps patients remember their exercises and gives them a video of what they ought to be doing can facilitate much faster and better practice of physical therapy at home and patient recovery. So things like this, we don't need, you know, and that's an app that can happen exclusively in the relationship between a patient and her physical therapist. Again, it doesn't need to be necessarily integrated into the electronic health record, but it does need to have some evidence from actual trials or from actual research, and it needs to be recognized by the healthcare practitioners as part of that patient's care. And so I think, you know, to answer your question, it's really, I think on a case-by-case basis, we need to ask what level of interaction and integration with the formal healthcare delivery system is going to be fit for purpose. You know, what are we doing? Is it a physical therapy app or is it an app that you know, is monitoring a very significant chronic disease where it's actually important that the data from that app be transmitted to multiple physicians because multiple physicians are involved in the management of that patient's health. So I think we just need to think about the purpose and the use case of each of these apps, and that can be a guiding force. That said, I'll just conclude by saying that a number of regulatory approval processes do exist. And I think exciting things are happening there. And I think both the European Medicines Agency as well as the US Food and Drug Administration have started a set of very productive conversations and policy discussions about how to regulate apps in the future in order to ensure that they're safe and effective, which I think is ultimately what we all want for patients.
Thank you. And now let's move on. Andreas, would you like to comment or ask Suzanne about her keynote?
Sure. Thank you, Suzanne, for your presentation. I think what you're doing brings a lot of hope to the world, and the threat of cancer is, with us all. I felt there's a big tension in what you're describing. You come from this idea that you're helping avoiding silos in data management in your organization, getting into fairness. You talk about interoperability, but there is also a tension between. You mentioned competitive data, and you talk about collaboration. So there's a tension here, I think, between doing things in-house, working in your organization, and then partnering up with other partners. And you specifically mentioned these recommendation systems for which of your treatments that is the best for the patient. But we see now a development where we want to achieve these global knowledge networks that help give patients the best treatment, irrespective of what company delivers the product. So I would like, maybe you could expand a little on specifically when you work with Cancer Research UK, how are you thinking in making knowledge globally available, and how are you also thinking about developing globally available recommendation systems and not just creating new silos and new unfair systems?
Yes, thanks for the question. I think it's a really good observation, actually, and it's something which is evolving quite rapidly, I think, within AstraZeneca and probably within multiple pharmaceutical companies across the world. So and it's by no means a solved problem either. So I think, that I get these sort of kind of comments a lot. When we've set up the Functional Genomics Centre with CRUK, the pre-work and the legal pre-work around that collaboration was huge. So there's definitely an aspiration from AstraZeneca's side to sort of break through those kinds of barriers in terms of being able to share data with other organisations, but there's still at the same time there is this conflict that you're pointing out, that there's sort of this reticence to, and the sort of requirement to keep the competitive data a secret. So, I think AstraZeneca is making great strides in the right direction in trying to make data much more open by default. We've got a program called the Open Innovation Program, which allows researchers around the world to access to AstraZeneca compounds so that we can sort of drive together towards new insights into the mechanisms of those compounds. So I think that there's much more appetite for it in AstraZeneca recently. So in specifically, I suppose in the CRUK case, it's early days for that collaboration, and that the aspiration eventually is to make those data sets available. And the databases that we're building in my group available much more broadly as public data sets. And I think the way that will go is that it will be closed data set for a period of time and then become open after a specific period of time. But already we're sharing the pre-competitive pieces with CRUK. So in terms of the methodologies and how to drive forward in terms of the bioinformatics techniques that we're using, and the quality control around the data. So making sure that we can share all of the upstream, so not the downstream results, but all of the upstream data, so that we can drive excellence in terms of the processes and the production of the data. So I think AstraZeneca and I'm sure other global pharmaceutical companies are sort of making great strides in the right direction, but it's definitely not a solved problem.
No. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, so I think we will return to that question as well. The question of how open is open enough, so to speak, and the timing of opening up your data, or when to commonize the data that you're working on. Thank you very much. Kathrin.
Open is a good word, so I think it's time to open up the floor for our common discussions. So I would like to invite and encourage the audience again to discuss with us. Please provide your answers in the question bar below. And Anna and I are continuously monitoring your inputs, and we will select a few ones to bring into the discussion. So far, we've heard a lot on like the research and development perspective, and also Ariel has highlighted that there is another important actor in this environment, namely institutions and governments. So Sweden is aiming to lead the digital transformation in healthcare. And I would like to ask Maja, can you tell us more about the Swedish eHealth Initiative 2025?
Hi, excited to be here. So we have what we call a vision actually about eHealth, which in which we work together with the SALAR, the Swedish Association of Regions and Municipalities. And I think there are many challenges, but strengths as well in this cooperation. We have formulated a goal that is that by 2025, Sweden will be best in the world by using the opportunities offered by digitalization and e-health in order to make it easier for people to achieve good and equal health and welfare, and to develop and strengthen their own resources for increased independence and societal participation. So there's a lot of words, but there's a great deal of meaning as well, I think. One part that I like is that we stress the opportunities of digitalization. I'm an engineer by myself, so I can get very enthusiastic about technology. But, let's never use technology for the sake of technology, but always for the sake of patients. I like that we stress what has been also stressed in this previous discussion, that health is so much more than healthcare. The great benefits of e-health is really to be found in public health and prevention. And I think that is an important part of the vision as well. Also, it's actually of great significance that the government works together with the regions in this. We have, as you know, in Sweden, a regionalized health and welfare system. So that is important.
You shortly mentioned that there are opportunities, of course, but also challenges to overcome, to share data between different actors across the country also. So what are you doing to address these challenges?
It's been a challenging few months to be State Secretary of Health, to say the least. But one of the things that we have been seeing during this pandemic is, of course, as also earlier mentioned, that many things has happened in e-health that we have been talking about for years, happened in weeks. And of course, that's fantastic, but you also start thinking about why didn't this happen before? Why do we need a pandemic to get sort of a real breakthrough in digital health visits? And I also think it's interesting what did not happen during the pandemic. That's almost more interesting. What technological breakthroughs didn't happen during the pandemic? And that's really the breakthroughs we have to pinpoint from the political side, I think. But to be, quite frank about your question, we have severe challenges in our legal systems in sharing data between regions and municipalities, and also, between regions. And that has been a legal challenge that we have been trying to address for years. But I'm very optimistic right now because we established an inquiry 1.5 years ago, led by my absolute favorite lawyer, Sören Öhman, who I have the greatest respect for. And Sören will be reporting his inquiry in January. And I think that we finally can get the last legal obstacles off the way.
So I totally agree with you, and we are in a special situation at the moment, so we also have to take the lessons we can learn at the moment to the future.
Absolutely. Yes. I'm looking at the questions here from the audience, and Lotta Collard, you write that a question: how can we overcome the cultural, regulatory and political differences in order to create successful global knowledge networks? You've spoken a little bit about that, Maja, the regulatory challenges, but what are the tensions, Maja, you think, that you need to overcome? I'm guessing there are different views regarding how to approach this in your work with the Swedish e-health strategy.
I mean, we have a regionalized system of healthcare in Sweden, and I will not put an end to my career by saying that we should change that. But of course, we need to take the benefits of having a regional system. There are parts of this that are really fantastic, with the possibilities of innovation, with the open systems and the possibilities for entrepreneurs to get into the health system. But of course, the regions are rather small, and there are challenges for large entrepreneurs to really understand the system, to be frank. And then we have SALAR, of course, and the NERA. But the overarching goal has to be equal health. And of course, there are challenges to equal health in a regionalized system. And I sometimes like to offend the region Stockholm by pointing out the skolplattformen. Us living in Stockholm know what that is. That is a digital platform for schools. And there's been a tendency that every region develops their own platform for school and parents. And I have 3 kids in 3 different schools with 3 different platforms, and it's really driving us crazy. And sometimes the wish for democracy and technological development does not lead to democracy. It leads to ill management of taxpayers' money, and that we have to get away from.
Thank you, and thank you for your question. Let's keep asking questions, you guys in the audience. I see you have posted more that we will bring up. But I want to move on and ask Erik a question as well, because now we've touched upon the Swedish policy perspective a little bit. And Erik, you have insight into the international policy discussions. And some claim that there are main differences between the European Union and the United States approach to regulating data. And I would like to ask you, what do you think are the main differences, and how do they pose challenges for transatlantic collaborations?
Oh, thank you. Well, since I don't have the rest of the day, I'll try to highlight some main points. But I mean, there is obvious legal differences, but also cultural differences. I think the main one, there's been a couple of surveys when it comes to data, again, then that in the US, consumers or patients or people in general are much more comfortable with private companies controlling or managing their data, but people seem to be quite uncomfortable having the government managing their data. And in Europe, specifically certain countries in Europe, Germany and Sweden, it's exactly the opposite. So in attitude surveys, people are very comfortable with having the government control and manage our data, whereas are much more negative or scared of having private companies accessing and control our data. So that's, I guess that cultural differences is both an outcome and sort of an input into policy and regulation. But I think, I mean, also what we can see is on the European level, and it was mentioned, been in some working groups that are sort of supposed to prepare for or influence future policy. And I think at the European level, there's a realization that when it comes to technology in general, we can talk about AI or medical technology in particular, both US and China are sort of, they have a technological advantage and are sort of far along. So the European strategy is to compete on good tech, which then translates to regulation, basically. And we can see this in the European Commission is quite aggressively taking on sort of big tech companies in their management of their data. And then earlier this year also launched the big data strategy that then identifies health as one of the key pillars. And GDPR, which is at least all us Europeans are familiar with, is one step in that. So I think that's the difference, that if we take Europe as an example, it's a much more government-run approach, whereas I think in the US, historically and legally, it's more industry-driven.
Thank you. So would you say that the EU has a more mature approach to data? Or would you say something else?
I mean, one can say that the European Union has taken a much more proactive approach to it and has spent a lot, probably a more effort into thinking how to try to sort of manage the evolution of what happens with data and AI. Definitely.
We'll see. Maybe, Ariel, you disagree with this, but I'll let you comment later on that. Thank you, Erik. Kathrin.
Erik, you mentioned also the topic of responsibilities, and when I have a look at our audience questions, there is one from Narai Sharma on where do you draw the line on how much data is gathered by the patient and put in the hands of the consumer. in contrast to collecting data from companies, from insurance companies. So I would like to ask this question to Lars, actually, who is in between like research and really applied work and trying to get knowledgeable or knowledge out of this data collected. So Lars, what do you think on this tension of perspectives between consumer companies, commercialization of data collected by consumers?
Actually, I don't think there is a big difference, because as the main was also the question, which is main challenges of the tamper data collection and spreading. And I think that the main thing that we have today is that we have a healthcare system where each individual is treated by the individual physician, but it's not really a system where you learn from that system. So all the data that we capture in the real life, data encounter is not brought forward. Seldom to the patient, actually, who is just seeing his own electronic record in an unmodified and unenriched form. So I think that we have lots of deficiencies. And then what we have done in this country in order to overcome some of this is that we have what we call quality of care registers. Swedish people know what that is, but it's a very beautiful system run by the profession, and we have been very active in rheumatology. A national system where we actually capture data from all the visits and sort of make a systematic type of way of getting knowledge from the real life in that way and capturing this type of data. Then this has also been extremely useful for our way of sort of introducing new therapies, making them safe and so on. And this has been a very internationally appreciated system where we have used in our EU projects and so on. The problems, however, are of several kinds. First, they are not really integrated into the healthcare. And this goes back to what Maja Fjæstad said. Second, they are seldom brought directly to the patients. And we are now making lots of effort trying to have this information that we are gathering in real life together with science, backing up for the patients so that they could sort of really access to their own knowledge, which is absolutely self-evident. But this doesn't really happen yet. But we have systems which we should build upon. And as I may come back to later, we have a fantastic system in Sweden which may make us very valuable for also prevention in that setting.
I think that's a very important aspect. You mentioned how also to keep the patient and the consumers motivated to collect data and to be tracked, that they see that this will have a benefit for them to do that, actually.
Yes. All right.
I could comment very briefly on that and say that many of the systems for capturing data are just for capturing. The successful quality of care registers in our country are those where you feed back the information directly to the patient, use it in the clinical practice.
Thank you. So we're talking about how to make those patients willing to donate and use data. And we talked about the need for not only having a system for pushing in data, but you also need to get something back. You need some incentive. But Andreas, could I ask you, maybe you have a little bit different perspective. You worked a lot with helping individuals to accumulate and learn from data and also share that data. What has surprised you regarding the willingness of individuals to invest time in these kinds of communities or data accumulation initiatives, if you will?
Well, I think we often talk about patient-centered care, and we think a lot about how to involve patients in healthcare system delivery. And sometimes when there is a lot of focus on that, that focuses very, very much on the situation of healthcare and physicians and researchers and so on. And there is sometimes they don't explore these feedback loops that Lars is talking about. But what always surprises me is that when you actually do some design and find these feedback loops where people understand for themselves why they're doing this, and I think we have a common understanding of what we want to achieve. We want healing, but for a person who lives with a chronic condition, that's very different from a doctor's notion of what healing is. So I would say that every time that the patient goes from being some kind of participant or some kind of object to becoming someone who's really empowered in the process, magic happens, and that surprises me all the time. That patients can actually gather high quality real world data if you find the right ways to do it. And when you have the patient with you, it also surprises me as a lawyer that GDPR loves it and everything just falls in place, and you can really achieve amazing information flows.
Sorry to interrupt you. I have a question connected to this. Aren't people more engaged if they are like currently ill and in troubles to use that? So how can we a little bit switch from to use it only if I'm ill to more prevention-focused healthcare? And I think Paul mentioned or was discussing on this topic.
Do you want Paul to comment or do you want me to comment shortly?
Both of you, like you're invited to.
Well,
Yes.
I think Paul made an important point in going from cure to prevention, but I think it's similar from a patient's view. There is some problem in our daily living that we want to manage. There is something good or something bad. It needs to connect to that, and if it's connected to illness or if it's connected to health, the difference is not very big, but it has to feel important and urgent to the individual, and that co-responsibility that Paul mentions, I think, comes from a mutual understanding where each stakeholder understands from their own perspective why we're sharing responsibility or why we're working together. So I think there are real practical ways of moving from healthcare to more preventative care. But I'm not so sure that it's healthcare that should take control of those processes. I think maybe it should be more the citizen or the individual itself.
So could you elaborate a little bit more about that? What do you mean? Is that related to the distinction between digital health and digital medicine, or is it something else? What do you mean by citizens running those processes rather than healthcare?
No, I think exactly that. And I think that Ariel talked about this institutional mismatch, and we saw how we have been talking now about how information integration and information flows the regulatory status of information can transform depending on where it is, how it is collected, and by whom. And if we say that the patient is a big four, but we don't have an institution that the patient can act from, that can actually be a place that has some regulatory status, then we are, I think, in trouble. So I think that's really what I would like to see, is to more focus on the domestic domain, protecting a space where we as citizens can collect information for ourselves. Everyone should watch The Social Dilemma that was recently released on Netflix, and I think we don't want that to happen in digital health and around medical devices, that we have business models that really destroy what we want to achieve.
I have to watch that. So this brings me to the legislative aspect, and you're saying that if everything clicks, if the loop is closed, so to speak, and the patient or individual feels that I'm getting something out of this, the legislation is not that much of a problem? Or do you think that, because we tend to talk so much about the regulative impediments and, oh, we cannot do this because we need to wait for the regulations to change, then we can do things. what do you think about this? Are we thinking maybe, are we having the wrong assumptions about the regulations right now?
I don't know. I heard Maja said that she loves a lawyer, and I think that's great. There must be something with this lawyer that he has, even on high governmental level, has some kind of entrepreneurial approach to understanding the social dilemmas. And she said also that he will have this solved by January, February. And I think that also says something that it could probably not, it doesn't have to be new legislation. Maybe it's a way to look at a legislation. Maybe it's a way to move norms, to think about business models, to think about architecture of these new information systems. And I think if we have lawyers that are more kind of engaged in this working together, then I think law and lawyers can have really a productive role, an entrepreneurial role in this. But sometimes we as lawyers are there to protect some existing status quo, and that's a different role of a lawyer. That's also a common role, protecting your lord.
Yeah.
Can I add a point of view on this? So I think legislation is really important, but we also need to look at it in a systemic way, and we still do it a single patient in the healthcare system. And I think you need to also staying healthy, and that's why we move to that co-responsibility. But what we are trying to do is also in design create methodologies to look at it in a systemic way and to look at interventions then. And not every intervention needs a Wi-Fi module and a battery pack. So, for instance, in Africa, we work on community life centers, and there we look at the referral to the center, and we created just a booklet for the community health workers to better educate pregnant women in this case. So I think we really need to learn to look at it as a system and look at interventions, and that systemic approach is still very difficult for us. And there aren't that many tools to do that and to have that discussion. So I think legislation is important, but only an element in the whole view.
Thank you. Yes, and I also think we see a lot of discussion about whether or not change is possible within the current regulatory frameworks. I think a lot is possible, and you show that by means of what you do. But we also need to think maybe broader and think about the space for the domestic activities, as we've touched upon. Do you want to bring up a question from the audience? Maybe?
Sure. Well, several presenters mentioned the role of global data and the problem with data quality and the lack of interoperability. So how could we make sure that we, or maybe implement common standardized information structures to enable this exchange, accessing of data and also feedbacking it back to the patient? So that's a question to the whole floor.
Maybe Suzanne could start by saying something about it based on your experience of allowing new actors to use the data and sharing data. How can you achieve, meta tags and standardizations that make data reusable across these groups?
Yeah, it's a real challenge, I think it's something that it's not solved even just within AstraZeneca itself. So we do have lots of legacy historical data silos, and we are putting in place and investing in, organizational ways of representing data, so master data management, reference data management, and making sure that people are using the sort of vocabularies and ontologies that would describe the data in a standardized way, even just within our own organization. I think with so there's a couple of things there. You know, we're putting, from my point of view, we're putting in technologies that enable people to be able to standardize the way they describe their data, but it's a really big cultural change for a lot of the groups, so there's I think that's part that sometimes, especially in IT, gets forgotten, right? That we need to encourage the organisation to change culturally about the way they think about data, and the fact that they're not just using it for a single experiment, but sharing it with the rest of the organisation. And you know, with collaborators, I mean, we're trying to make as much use of public efforts and public vocabularies as much as possible, so that our data can be interoperable with external data. But oftentimes you find that there are different approaches to standardization, even within the initiatives that are springing up. You've got multiple initiatives, not all taking necessarily the same approach, and so I think that's something that we need to stay on top of, be aware of the initiatives that are ongoing, and that we put a reasonable amount of effort into being part of those sort of organizations that are building standardized vocabularies.
Can I ask you, Suzanne, because this has been such an ongoing discussion for decades, right? How to motivate people to adhere to the standards and using metadata tags that will allow reuse. But it seems like no one really has the authority to mandate all the involved actors to use a certain metadata standard or a standard, and the standards are changing all the time. So there could be a tendency for a researcher to use the tags that are useful in relation to my own research project. And as you say, if someone else wants to reuse this in the future, well, I don't have the money or time to tag my data in all kinds of ways that will make it reusable. So what are you doing there more concretely? Are you saying to the researchers you are collaborating with that you have to adopt these standards, or are you allowing them freedom?
Yeah, so I think that, so on my final slide, I think I had something about sort of top-down sponsorship of data and standardized data approaches. I think it's something that AstraZeneca hasn't done well in the past, but really is in the last few years has really been taking, got real senior level sponsorship in the organization to invest in making sure that we're using the right ways of representing data. I think Lars mentioned, or somebody mentioned earlier, incentivizing people as well. And again, we're looking into different ways of doing that, from the sort of gamification type work within the company. So being able to reward people for the way that they're representing their data and how they're making it available to the organisation. But we do still have pockets of people who are just thinking about the data for their own use as well. And it's we're taking similar approaches to the healthcare organisations in trying to sort of incentivize people and reward people for representing data in the right way.
Thank you. I would love to hear more about the gaming approach you're using. Could you give us some insight into it?
So it's really just about enabling people to see how fair their data is, so how findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable their data is, and giving people sort of dashboards and things that would score them in terms of how good the data is that they're sharing with the organisation, and that visualization gives people the incentive to move their bar upwards in terms of those measurables.
Interesting, thank you.
Maybe a question which touches upon this is how can we ensure the knowledge from either patients and also healthcare professionals and institutions in knowing how to use the data actually collected? So you say you make the data available there, they can access the data, but how we make it sure that the data is really used and maybe also in an entrepreneurial way used.
So I bet it's probably not a question for me, but it was something that I was thinking about earlier, actually, when I think Lars and Andreas were talking. Because, you know, we're saying we want to give patients back their data and empower them to use their data. But even within our research organisation, we have you know, people who are thinking about data, and actually I'm the person who knows how to interpret that data, and I don't want to share it because somebody might misinterpret the data. So that was something I wanted to ask Lars and Andreas about, how we empower patients but also give them the right information to be able to interpret the data appropriately.
So I think that Andrea had some comment first, and I could comment later.
And I think Ariel was Do you want to jump in?
Ariel, yeah, sorry.
Oh, sure. I can dive in. I'd actually, I'd love to hear the answer to Suzanne's question as well. I think I just wanted to chime in and build on what Suzanne was saying. In particular, I think there are two sets of questions we're discussing here. I think the first, which is absolutely right, is about data standards and data formats, which is extraordinarily important, and that's a necessary but not sufficient precondition for doing effective things with data sharing. I think there's a second set of questions around use cases and applications, and I would say that's an area where we have to be extraordinarily cautious. The legal scholars, and I'm not one of them, so I'll defer to my co-panelists, talk about contextual bias in healthcare, and the concern there is that the best practices at an academic university hospital in Sweden, even meticulously collected data in an interoperable standard that could be then used to think about making treatment recommendations for another healthcare setting, simply might not be relevant. So taking data from an academic hospital in Europe and trying to apply that information to algorithms that guide care in a community hospital in Canada, that could be problematic in a number of ways. And so I think about, when we think about data, we need to think about standards and formats and all of the issues Suzanne was talking about, but we also need to think about applications and use cases and how that data might be used, and ask really, really important questions about, is this a context where the data that we've collected are appropriate for translation to another setting? Can we learn from a Swedish academic university hospital about how to do treatment in Canada, or is that not the case? And so I think there's a tremendous call for data and for algorithmic proficiency among healthcare providers and anyone who's trying to apply data to say, is this a context where we can take data from one setting and learn from that data in another setting? I think clinical trials are an excellent example. So, clinical trials for glioblastoma, we're likely to learn quite a bit from a study site in Sweden about how a new drug will work at a study site in North America. But other cases are much less clear. And in particular, as we get into the types of algorithms that guide care delivery, we could run into some trouble. So I just wanted to highlight how important it is to be thoughtful about data translation and contextual bias in healthcare delivery.
I can mention three things that I think we have learned in Sweden, and I think Lars would agree. One is the feedback loops that has been mentioned, that understand what feedback loops every stakeholder needs. The second one is a learning environment where you can iterate, because you start doing something and then you learn. So you have to, the budget must include some way to improve the systems. And the third thing, which I come to think about now with Ariel's answer, is access to the physical space or the human subjects or the human tissues that were once the source of the data, because our digital imprints will always be some subset of information. It will always be so small compared to all the contextual and all the things that are really we want to describe. So that's something that I think Lars's system in rheumatology has been really good at, making sure that you have this ongoing relationship with the patient, an ongoing relationship with the providers in the system, so that you can go back and ask those contextual questions. So you can explore, and then you can go back and do the research later on with more qualitative ways of understanding the differences.
Maybe I could comment briefly also on Ariel. And what I actually think is that the differences between different people in Sweden are much larger, and different people in Canada are much larger than the sort of overall differences between Canada and Sweden. So I think that what we're talking about, individualization, so that we could sort of understand what the individual is needing, is much more important than the differences between countries. Thus, I think that the knowledge gained about this, what we call personalized medicine sometimes, in one country can most of the time been transferred to other countries in a very good way. So I'm not so afraid of these country differences. I'm more sort of concerned about inter-individual differences. And then a few words about the data sharing. My experience is that all patients are very eager to share their data if it can benefit the development of better care and better prevention for that particular disease. But then we have a number of both laws and conventions that preclude personal data to be transferred between different units and different countries. And here we have a technology development. We are talking about technologies to some extent today, and there are ways whereby you could sort of deposit all the sensitive data in one silo, but still making that silo accessible for analysis from other sources. And we are discussing that a lot in our various European-wide projects. So that's it's possible, but the solutions are not there yet. And again, I think that going back to personalized things, taking genetics and taking other things into account when you make recommendations, that's the way we have to go, of course. And that information should be always transferred and be available for patients so they know that the lifestyle that I need to change may be different depending on what type of genetics, what type of other features you have. And I think that type of information is not yet conferred to the patient, but should be, and we have technical means to develop.
Thank you. Andreas, I know you've done work, you've tried to understand the different contexts in which data may be used. You're talking about different arenas. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that, how this fits in.
No, I think Ariel talked about the institutional mismatch, and I think Elinor Ostrom has done a lot of work on describing knowledge commons and people working together around different social dilemmas. And what we found out in our research work at Karolinska around knowledge commons and the patient control data is that if you start to structure up and distinguish the patient as an institution trying to solve her social dilemmas in the domestic setting, and you have the clinical microsystem where the frontline units of healthcare are trying to solve also together with the patient problems, and then you have the kind of the environment that Suzanne represents here, and also Paul to some extent, where which we call the roundtable arenas, where different stakeholders need to come together to solve these global, long-term, structural problems. And if we design these things and design the feedback loops, understand what feedback loops does the family and patient need in the domestic domain, what feedback loops does the clinic need, and what feedback loops or what information are we interested in the global knowledge network of a roundtable arena, then you can actually within existing systems come quite far. And I think the novelty here is really acknowledging that the patient is one of the big four, and that the patient needs an institution of herself.
Thank you. I think we're starting to need to to close down this session, although there are so many topics I would like to delve more into. So please continue the discussion after this webinar. Kathrin, would you like to jump in?
Yes, I would like to ask, because it was mentioned, we talked a lot about the individual and the empowerment of the user. So I would like to ask a last question to Maja, who should own the data? And do you think that Sweden would give the possibility to patients to take out the data out of the healthcare system, the whole data, or only parts of it? So how is Sweden currently thinking about this data issue, empowerment?
And that's really the key issue somewhere, I think. I mean, we really want to have this e-health revolution to empower the patient and really to shift power, I mean, from institutions to the patients. But how do we do this in a good way? And there was this really interesting article in The Lancet a year ago that was saying that health data is not the new oil. Health data is blood. So we have to, like we have blood banks. We handle these samples with great care. And I think that's an important point about healthcare data as well. It has to be handled with care. And I'm sometimes thinking that we need to have, I mean, the short answer is, of course, that the individual should own the data. But what is really owning the data, and how do we make that in an efficient way? I mean, it's been pointing out here in the previous discussion that data is collected in formats that are not really containing all the information. Data is collected in scattered way. And I think, to me, it's more common situation is that the patient comes to the doctor, been collecting data with their watch or something, or their app, saying that, so I have this really funky data, I don't know how to interpret it. And the doctor says that, hey, that's not my collection. We don't do these samples here. And the risk is that the patient lose trust in healthcare if they don't get help interpreting their data from we have a general welfare system. We need to have trust in the tax-financed welfare healthcare system to remain the trust from the general citizens. So to me, that's really the top political priority. Keep trust in the welfare system, and then the welfare system has to deliver. It has to help the patient interpret data, but it also has to help the patient empower him or herself in relationship to the data and feel safe with the data. So I think it's a very broad issue. It's extremely interesting.
Thank you, Maja. I'm looking a little bit at the time, so I think it's time to do a final round and grasp the ideas of all our speakers.
Yeah. And, we initially asked the audience to write, what do you think is the most critical challenge that we need to address in order to achieve smart knowledge networks, in order to allow data to make a difference that will improve living conditions for individuals and societies. And you have written access to the data, patient empowerment, move to personalized health, implementation of AI in healthcare. And we haven't spoken so much about that. Open culture rather than rigidity in organizations, remove silos, knowledge from patients and healthcare professionals in knowing how to use the data. We've touched upon that. Some glimpses from the audience. And keeping those in mind, I would like to ask you, the keynote speakers, you in the panel, where do you think your current struggles and efforts will fit into the overall knowledge networks that we're all trying to achieve somehow? There are so many actors that are currently working with learning, accumulating and learning from data in different industries, in different settings, partly redundant, partly complementary. So where would you like to fit into this bigger puzzle? What do you hope to achieve? So why don't we start with Paul?
I think Andreas talked about it a few times, the feedback loops. So I think there are no big data transformations without small data. So the balance between the big data and how it becomes relevant in your personal or local situation or your hospital situation, I think will be the key. So balancing big data with small data, and then interfaces and data visualization and AI are really relevant tools to make that data meaningful.
Thank you. Thank you. And what about you, Erik? How do you see your work?
Well, I can share in a bigger perspective. I teach our master students a course in data science strategy, which is focused on use cases. And every year the students ask me what they should learn if they want to have a career in AI or work with AI. And I assume they're thinking what programming language or what database. But my answer is always they should study more law, because the level at where the technology is right now, every conceivable idea is possible or will be feasible very, very soon. So that's not technologically anything is possible. The challenge is understanding legally what's possible and feasible.
Thank you. So let's move to Andreas, who has the legal perspective. Where do you think your work will fit in?
I think I already said, and I just want to really use the words of Ariel, that I think that I am working with making the patient a truly big four. And I think that in the institutional mismatch, creating robust institutions for the human being, not the consumer, not the patient, not the citizen, finding some space here for the human being. Because that's where we start the healing. And I think that's the biggest hope, to take cost out of healthcare also. We need somewhere to put activities that don't cost anything. We're getting to a society where everything costs, and I think that's sad.
Thank you. Ariel, what about you?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I would just add, I think when we think about these 4 Ps, I think it's extraordinarily and increasingly important to think about the perspective of other players in the system. So in a world where we're generating data, if that data has no value or is opaque or counterproductive or just impossible to use for any of the other parties, we're in trouble. I think a perfect example are some of the earlier ways in which electronic health records were developed. They were developed for hospital billing systems. They weren't developed to be useful for physicians. They weren't developed to be useful for patients. And so many of our current struggles, indeed on both sides of the Atlantic, are around taking this data from electronic health records in the way that they were conceived of over a decade ago or even 2 decades ago, and trying to make them useful for other parties in the healthcare system. And so I think as we think about developing new tools and new data management systems and the strategies behind them, it will only be more important that we think about the value of that data, the usability of that data, and the applications of that data for one of the other Ps. And if that data isn't useful for any of the other key parties in the healthcare system, then we're in trouble.
Thank you. Maja, would you like to reflect on your role here?
What's the role of policymakers? You ask that yourself sometimes, but I'm sometimes a bit afraid of the notion that technology is a self-driving force. I think it's important to keep a perspective of democracy or equality, if you like. It's important that we have a democratic scrutiny and assessment of technology. I mean, we all speak here about the idea that e-health will lead to empowerment of the patients, but that will not happen by itself. We have to drive development in that direction. So, I would definitely say that, safeguard equality and democracy. That's a very bombastic answer, but you did ask.
I think it's a great answer. Thank you. And Lars, would you like to continue?
Yes, in a way, having spent my life in science, I would say that it takes far too long time today for scientific progress, which happens extremely rapidly and fantastically, to come to the patients. So I would say science to the patients and making it more direct so that the relevant new findings can be directed directly in an app or whatever to the patient. That is what we should do. And that also fosters equality. Second is also that we now know how to detect emerging disease. It may be cancer, it may be rheumatoid arthritis, very early, and intercept as a not public health, not necessarily, but we could call personalized prevention. I think that is where we should go.
Thank you. I did not forget anyone.
Suzanne, yes.
Suzanne, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm not sure I wanted the last word, but I think my comments would come back to the questions that Andreas was asking me at the beginning, which is around sort of overcoming the boundaries. I think every organisation has to take on the responsibility to overcome the boundaries, legal or otherwise, to share the data and really learn from the things that the things like that policymakers and Maja was talking about, and around the world, to enable people to gain the benefits from the things that we're doing.
Thank you so much. Should we allow the audience one final comment or question? Do we have time?
I think we are short on time.
We are short on time. Okay. So thank you so much. It's been such a great pleasure to interact with you and listen to you. Please continue after this session. I think this conversation has provided a broad insight into the numerous efforts that are currently ongoing, right? So things are happening right now, and things are happening with our understanding of what makes data useful and impactful. I think you all have touched upon the need to think both and, not only making data visual in a way that attracts me as an actor, but that makes data possible to use across contexts. And maintaining those feedback loops across contexts is quite a challenge, because it requires us to build relationships and interfaces between these contexts. I hope that you've learned something about the nuances of data, how we can understand data. Paul, you talked about the meaningfulness of data, that data is not meaningful per se. And I think we tend to encounter a lot of generalized claims about data, right? The data-driven society, and many discussions treat data as homogeneous tokens that will lead to great improvements. But I think in this session, we've really unpacked a little bit of the process in between the data and its use. Would you like to add something?
Well, thank you to our keynote speakers and panel for the discussion, but let's keep on the discussion.
Yes.
It's an important topic.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Essén and Kathrin Reinsberger, for moderating this highly insightful session and module. And I also would like to thank all our speakers. We know now that we have a very engaged audience. So I would also like to express a warm thank you all for engaging, for sending in your questions and keeping the discussion alive in the chat. Thank you very much for that. This actually concludes the first module of the day. And very soon we will all be off for a well-deserved break. But before that, just a few words on what's coming up next. So the second module of the day will focus on smart regions. We will look at how to connect people with communities, with organizations, and how this can act as a driver for social innovation and ultimately create benefits for people and society. This session will be moderated by Professor Sarah Jack, whom you've already met, and Associate Professor Anders Richtner, both of the Stockholm School of Economics. And as usual, we have a very impressive lineup of speakers for this module as well. So with that, thank you very much for participating, and welcome back at 11:45. See you then.